The bell above the glass entrance of Greenhill's supermarket jingled with a familiar, cheerful tone as Ethan Vale pushed through the doors. It was 4:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. He knew the exact time because the analog watch on his left wrist still ticked steadily, a 16th birthday gift from his parents that had become one of his most prized possessions. Outside, the sky was a soft, hazy blue, the kind that usually promised a quiet evening and a slow descent into night. But inside, the air smelled exactly as it always did, a comforting mix of fresh-baked bread from the in-store bakery, polished floor wax, the sharp tang of cleaning supplies, and the subtle metallic scent of rows upon rows of canned goods. It was ordinary, predictable, boring even. Ethan was 16 years old, with dark, unruly hair and eyes that seemed to notice everything even when he wasn't trying. He was the kind of teenager who preferred to stay in the background, quiet, observant, someone who listened more than he spoke. Schoolmates often forgot he was in the room until he raised his hand, and teachers sometimes commented on how he seemed to see details others missed. That afternoon, he had stopped here on his way home from school, carrying a crumpled handwritten list in his jacket pocket. His mother had left it on the kitchen table that morning before heading to her job at the hospital. Milk, eggs, rice, soup, and a few apples if they looked good. It was supposed to be a simple, routine errand. Nothing more. He grabbed a small hand basket near the entrance instead of a large trolley, old habit, preferring to move freely and not draw attention, and began to walk slowly down the first aisle. The store was moderately busy, filled with the usual mix of people. Mothers with young children, elderly shoppers pushing carts carefully, teenagers laughing and grabbing snacks, and uniformed staff restocking shelves. It was the same scene that played out every single day, and for a while, everything felt exactly as it should. But then slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with the phones. At first, it was nothing more than a few people glancing down at their screens, their smiles fading into looks of confusion or mild concern. Then the murmuring began. It started as isolated whispers, then grew into a low hum that drifted through the aisles. "Did you see this?" someone asked. "It's on the news, all over social media." Another voice replied, sharp with disbelief. "They're saying there are attacks. Violent ones downtown and across the river." Ethan paused near the cereal aisle, his hand resting lightly on the box of plain oats his mother preferred. He frowned. That morning, he had caught a few minutes of the morning news while eating breakfast. There had been mentions of unrest, of strange incidents in distant cities, but the reporters had brushed it off as mass hysteria, a new street drug causing unpredictable behavior or isolated acts of violence. "There is no cause for widespread alarm," the anchor had said with a reassuring smile. "Authorities are on the scene, and the situation is under control." But the tension in the supermarket was thickening by the second, turning the air heavy and difficult to breathe. More people were pulling out their phones now, their faces growing pale. Conversations stopped abruptly as everyone seemed to turn inward, reading the same terrible updates. Then, without warning, the calm was shattered by the sound of the store's public address system clicking on. A sharp, electronic tone rang out, followed by a voice that was not the usual friendly announcement about sales or lost children. "This is an official public safety alert," the voice said, flat and urgent. "Reports of widespread civil unrest and unexplained violent incidents have been confirmed across multiple regions. All citizens are advised to immediately seek shelter in a secure location, lock all doors and windows, and avoid all contact with anyone displaying unusual or aggressive behavior. Do not attempt to travel unless it is absolutely necessary. Repeat, do not attempt to travel unless it is absolutely necessary." The announcement played twice, and by the time it finished, panic had already begun to spread. What had been quiet conversation erupted into shouting. People abandoned their baskets and carts where they stood, turning as one toward the front doors. The calm, orderly store dissolved into chaos. Cans and boxes were knocked from shelves as people pushed past one another, desperate to get out. Small children began to cry, their voices lost in the roar of the crowd. Ethan stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He looked toward the glass entrance, and what he saw there made his blood turn to ice in his veins. Outside, the street had transformed from a quiet residential road into a scene of madness. Cars were swerving wildly, crashing into one another and mounting the curb. People were running in every direction, screaming, but not all of them were fleeing. Some moved in ways that were wrong, unnatural, jerky, and stiff, as if their bones had turned to wood. Their clothes were torn and stained, their skin pale and bruised, and their eyes held a vacant, glassy stare that seemed to see nothing and everything at once. One man stumbled toward a woman standing near the sidewalk. He moved with slow, shuffling steps, but there was a terrible, relentless purpose in his motion. Before she could react, he lunged. Her scream cut through the noise, sharp and terrified, and Ethan felt his stomach twist. Then the glass doors of the supermarket burst open. Several figures stumbled inside. They were just like the ones on the street, disheveled, moving with that same awkward, uncoordinated gait and emitting low, guttural moans that sounded less like human speech and more like the growl of a wounded animal. The air suddenly filled with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp, coppery smell of fear. Chaos exploded inside the store. Screams echoed off the high, tiled ceilings. People tripped over fallen displays and rolling cans, scrambling backward as the infected advanced. But these things did not stop. They did not feel pain, did not hesitate, did not show mercy. They moved only toward the nearest source of sound and warmth, driven by a single, terrifying hunger. Ethan watched in horror as a man near the checkout counters was pulled down, the sound of the struggle sending a wave of nausea through him. He knew he couldn't stay near the front. If he joined the crowd, he would be trampled or caught in the stampede. If he tried to run outside, he would meet the same fate as those on the street. Instinct took over, overriding the shock and fear. He turned away from the carnage, his basket slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor, and ran toward the back of the store. He ducked behind a tall stack of wooden pallets piled high with boxes of bottled water, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. His heart hammered against his ribs, so hard he could hear it in his own ears. Ahead of him, partially hidden behind a row of freezers, was a heavy metal door marked with a faded, peeling sign. Employees only authorized personnel beyond this point. Behind him, the sounds of violence and screaming were growing closer. He could hear the heavy, dragging footsteps and those terrible, inhuman moans. There was no time to think. He lunged forward, grabbed the cold metal handle, pulled the door open just enough to slip through, and slammed it shut behind him. His fingers fumbled for a moment before finding the heavy deadbolt, sliding it firmly into place with a satisfying click. For a moment, everything went silent. The noise from the front of the store was muffled, distant, as if it were happening in another world. Ethan leaned back against the door, his whole body trembling, and slowly slid down until he was sitting on the cold concrete floor. He pressed his hands over his mouth to muffle his own breathing, listening intently for any sound outside. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, and slowly the shouting and screaming died down. What replaced it was far worse, a low, constant chorus of moans and shuffling feet that drifted through the walls. When he finally felt steady enough to move, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was dark. The signal had vanished completely, replaced by a single flashing icon that offered no information. He stuffed it back into his pocket and stood up, turning to take in his surroundings. He found himself in a long, narrow corridor lined with shelves filled with cleaning chemicals, plastic bags, boxes of receipt paper, and stacks of cardboard. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, steady glow over everything. As he walked deeper, the corridor opened up into a large, sprawling storage complex, the heart of the supermarket. This was the place where everything was kept before it was put out on the shelves. It was vast, and as his eyes scanned the area, Ethan realized just how lucky he had been to find it. To his left stood the walk-in refrigerator and freezer room, massive, insulated, and built from thick steel panels. Its heavy doors were slightly ajar, and a cool, refreshing breeze drifted out into the warmer air. Through the small glass viewing window set into the door, he could see rows upon rows of packaged meats, frozen vegetables, ice cream, dairy products, and large blocks of cheese. It was all sealed, all preserved, and if the power stayed on, it could last for months, maybe even longer. To his right and stretching all the way to the back wall were towering shelves, packed from floor to ceiling with non-perishable goods. There were hundreds of cans: beans, corn, peas, carrots, peaches, pears, soup, tuna, chicken, and even canned bread. There were sacks of rice, bags of flour, boxes of pasta, jars of peanut butter, and sealed plastic containers filled with sugar, salt, and spices. Stacked neatly beside them were cases of bottled water, gallons of purified drinking water, and large jugs of juice. It was a mountain of food, enough to sustain a single person for a very long time. Against the far wall stood a heavy wooden workbench, covered in tools and equipment. There were claw hammers, flathead and Phillips screwdrivers, adjustable wrenches, pliers, and heavy-duty wire cutters. Beside them lay rolls of industrial-strength duct tape, thick nylon rope, heavy plastic sheeting, and several large fire extinguishers. Tucked beneath the bench were hard hats, work gloves, and even a few heavy blankets. But what caught Ethan's attention most was the small, glass-walled office tucked into the corner of the storage area. Inside, sitting on a desk, was a bank of television monitors connected to a closed-circuit security system. It was still running, the screens glowing softly with black and white footage from cameras placed all over the store. Ethan walked slowly toward it, his footsteps silent on the rubberized floor mats. He pulled out the office chair and sat down, staring at the screens. Every angle of the supermarket was visible. The front entrance, the checkout counters, the main aisles, the bakery, the produce section, and even the parking lot outside. For the next several hours, he watched the horror unfold from the safety of that small room. He saw the infected wander aimlessly through the aisles, their movements slow and erratic. He noticed immediately that they reacted to sound. When something fell or rolled across the floor, every head in the frame would snap toward the noise, and they would begin to shuffle toward it. If nothing moved or made a sound, they seemed to lose interest, drifting away again. They were blind to stillness, deaf to silence, but noise and movement acted like a beacon, drawing them from far away. Night fell and still he watched. The lights in the main store remained on, powered by the city grid, but the place felt empty and dead. The only sounds that reached him through the walls were the occasional low moan or the scrape of feet on linoleum. Days turned into weeks. At first, Ethan lost track of time, falling into a daze of shock and fear. But soon, his practical nature took over. He needed to know how long he had been there, so he took a small nail from the workbench and began marking the days on the concrete wall beside the office, one scratch for each morning when he woke up. 1, 2, 3. A week. 2 weeks. He settled into a routine, born of necessity and observation. He learned very quickly that silence was his greatest weapon. He moved only when he absolutely had to, placing his feet carefully to avoid making even the slightest scuff or scrape. He learned to breathe slowly and quietly, holding his breath when he heard anything moving nearby. He began to ration his food strictly, eating only 2 small meals a day, enough to keep his strength up but never wasting anything. He drank sparingly, knowing that water was more valuable than gold. But he also knew that he couldn't stay locked in the storage room forever. There would be times when he might need to move through the store, or when the infected might find a way in. So, using what he had learned from watching them on the cameras, he began to prepare. He started creating what he called distraction traps. In the farthest corners of the store, the areas he had named the dead zone, where the most infected gathered, he set up simple triggers. He balanced heavy metal cans on thin strings stretched across the tops of shelves, or propped up metal rods that would fall and clatter loudly if knocked. From his hiding place, he could pull on a long length of fishing line he found in the sporting goods aisle, sending the cans crashing down. The noise would echo through the entire building, drawing every infected within range toward the sound, leaving the rest of the store temporarily clear. Next, he mapped out alternate paths. He discovered narrow service aisles behind the main shelves, spaces used by staff to restock from the back. These were hidden from view, cluttered with boxes and pallets, and perfect for moving without being seen. He learned every turn, every dead end, every hidden gap, creating a winding, confusing network he later named the maze. It was a place designed to confuse anyone or anything that didn't know its secrets. He also fortified his home. The main employee entrance was the weakest point, so he stacked heavy wooden pallets, concrete blocks, and cases of bottled water against it, piling them high enough to reach the ceiling. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a collapsed mess of debris, left behind in the panic of the first day. But from the inside, it was a solid barrier. He checked it every morning and every night, running his hands along the edges to make sure nothing had shifted or weakened. For nearly 3 weeks, this system worked perfectly. He was safe, he was hidden, and he had everything he needed. But on the 21st day, everything changed. It was late in the evening, and Ethan was sitting in the office, watching the monitors as usual. Most of the infected were clustered near the front of the store, as they usually were. But then, on the screen showing the loading dock, the large metal door at the very back of the building, he saw something move. The door had been damaged during the chaos of the first day. One of its hinges had been bent, and the heavy locking mechanism had rusted slightly over the weeks. Slowly, steadily, it began to creak open. At first, only a crack appeared. Then it widened, pushed from the outside by slow, relentless pressure. One figure stumbled inside, then another, then a third. They shuffled forward, drawn perhaps by the faint smell of food drifting from the storage area, or perhaps just moving by instinct. They moved slowly, but they were getting closer with every step. Ethan felt his heart begin to race again. He watched them move past the loading dock area and into the back storage aisles, getting closer and closer to the corridor that led to his safe room. If they turned the corner, they would be right outside his door. He couldn't stay there. If they got too close, even the sound of his breathing might be enough to draw them in. He had to move. With agonizing slowness, he stood up, grabbed a heavy metal pipe from the workbench, just in case, and slipped out of the office. He unbolted the inner door, pulling it open just enough to squeeze through, and left it slightly ajar behind him. He moved like a shadow, his back pressed flat against the wall, his steps so light they barely made a sound. He could hear them now. The shuffling of feet, the scraping of nails against metal shelves, and that low, guttural moaning that seemed to vibrate in his bones. One of them turned its head suddenly, tilting it from side to side as if listening. Ethan froze instantly, pressing himself into the narrow gap between 2 tall stacks of boxes. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. He waited until the figure turned away and continued shuffling forward. He remembered the traps. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone he kept there for emergencies. With a careful, practiced motion, he tossed it as hard and as quietly as he could down the opposite aisle. It hit a metal shelf with a sharp, distinct clink. Instantly, all 3 figures turned as one. Their moans grew louder, hungrier, and they began to shuffle quickly toward the sound, moving away from Ethan and deeper into the store. He seized his chance. He slipped through the gap in the shelving and moved quickly but silently into the maze, following the winding paths he had memorized. He hid behind a tall display of canned vegetables, watching through the gaps as the infected wandered past, drawn toward the noise he had created. When they were finally gone and the area was quiet again, Ethan leaned his head back against the cold metal shelf and let out a long, silent breath. He had survived, but the encounter had taught him a harsh lesson. The supermarket was no longer a shelter. It was no longer just a place to hide and wait for help to arrive. It had become a hunting ground, a maze where the predators roamed the open spaces, and he was the only prey smart enough to stay out of sight. He looked around at the dim, empty aisles, listening to the distant sounds of the dead, and realized with a heavy certainty that his life had changed forever. The world outside had gone silent, and inside the silence was just as dangerous. But as he began to make his way back toward his fortified safe room, moving through the shadows with a new, sharp awareness, Ethan also realized something else. He was learning. He was adapting. And as long as he stayed quiet, stayed hidden, and used every advantage he could find, he had a chance. Time began to stretch and warp in the months that followed. What had once been measured by school bells, television schedules, and the rising and setting of the sun slowly dissolved into a slower, heavier rhythm, one dictated only by hunger, rest, and the constant, watchful silence. For Ethan Vale, each day was marked not by dates on a calendar, but by the steady addition of another thin scratch on the concrete wall beside his bed. 120 days. 150. 200. His 16th birthday came and went unnoticed, marked only by a slightly larger scratch and the careful opening of a single can of sliced peaches, saved for weeks as a small luxury. The boy who had once been quiet and observant had transformed into something else entirely. He had become sharp, cautious, and endlessly patient. The fear that had gripped him in those first chaotic weeks had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the paralyzing terror of the unknown. Instead, it had become a constant, low hum in the back of his mind, a reminder that a single mistake, a single careless sound, could mean the end. He knew every inch of Green Hills Supermarket better than he knew his own childhood home. He could walk from one end to the other in total darkness, navigating by touch and memory alone. To make sense of the vast space and the dangers within it, he had begun naming the different zones, turning the store into a living map in his mind. The area near the shattered glass front entrance, where the largest number of infected usually lingered, he called the dead zone. It was wide open, brightly lit by the natural light filtering through the broken windows and deceptively quiet. But it was the most dangerous place in the building. The dead gathered there, drawn by the faint drafts of air and the distant sounds from the street outside, and they were easily agitated. He never entered it unless absolutely necessary. The winding network of narrow service aisles, hidden gaps between shelves, and forgotten storage nooks that snaked behind the main displays became the maze. It was confusing, full of dead ends and sudden turns, and deliberately designed to be disorienting to anyone who did not know its secrets. It was his highway, his escape route, and his shield. And the fortified storage room in the back, with its locked doors, stacked barriers, and the security monitors, was simply the safe room. It was his fortress, his bedroom, his kitchen, and his only sanctuary in a world that had gone mad. Ethan spent much of his time maintaining and improving his domain. The security cameras, which had been working sporadically, began to fail one by one as dust settled on the lenses and wiring corroded. Using tools from the maintenance bench and rolls of electrical tape he found in the hardware section, he carefully took them apart, cleaned the connections, and rerouted damaged wires. He drew detailed maps on large sheets of paper he found in the office supply aisle, marking every safe path, every danger spot, every trap, and every hiding place. He kept these maps rolled up and stored in a waterproof plastic bag, checking them often and updating them as the layout of the store slowly changed. Shelves collapsing, debris shifting, new paths opening up. Rationing became a science. He learned exactly how much food and water his body needed to stay strong without wasting anything. The walk-in freezer was his greatest asset. Kept at a steady temperature by the main power grid, it preserved the meat, frozen vegetables, and dairy for months. But he knew he could not rely on electricity forever, so he gradually shifted his diet to rely more heavily on canned goods and dried foods, rice, pasta, oats, and powdered milk, which would last for years if stored properly. He learned to eat slowly, to savor every bite, and never to make noise while doing so. Even the sound of a can opening could carry farther than he liked. He moved through the store like a ghost. He had learned to walk with his weight on the balls of his feet, his steps so light they barely disturbed the dust on the floor. He avoided metal surfaces whenever possible, sticking to carpeted aisles or soft rubber mats. He had even modified his clothing, sewing thick layers of fabric into the cuffs of his sleeves and pant legs to stop them from brushing against shelves, and making that faint, rustling sound that could attract attention. He was no longer just hiding, he was blending into the very shadows themselves. But no matter how careful he was, the world was changing, and the safety he had built began to feel more fragile with every passing week. It happened on a quiet evening, nearly 4 months after the outbreak began. Ethan was sitting in the office, watching the monitors, when the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead suddenly cut out. There was a sharp click, and then nothing, darkness. Absolute, suffocating darkness swallowed the entire building instantly. The monitors flickered once, twice, and then went dead, leaving only black screens reflecting his own wide eyes. The silence that followed was heavier than any he had ever known. Without the constant low hum of electricity, the building felt older, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The power had failed. Ethan sat perfectly still for a long moment, his heart beginning to beat faster. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Panic made noise. Panic made mistakes. He reached out slowly, his hand moving through the familiar dark until his fingers closed around the heavy flashlight he kept on the desk. He twisted the lens cover so that only a thin, narrow beam of light escaped, bright enough to see by, but dim enough not to be seen from a distance. He stood up and listened. Somewhere in the distance, deeper in the store, a low moan echoed through the darkness. Then another and another. The sudden silence seemed to have stirred them. They were moving, shuffling through the aisles, confused but still driven by instinct. But the danger was more immediate than just the loss of light. Without electricity, the massive compressors in the walk-in freezer would slowly stop working. The temperature would rise, and within days, all the frozen food he had relied on would thaw and spoil. Worse, he had lost his eyes. The security cameras were dead. He could no longer see what was coming until it was right in front of him. He was blind in the dark. There was only one solution. The supermarket had a backup generator, a large diesel-powered unit located in a small concrete shed attached to the outer wall near the loading dock. It was designed to kick in automatically if the main power failed, but like everything else in the world, it had likely been damaged or disabled by the chaos of the first days. Ethan knew he had to get there, refuel it if necessary, and restart it. If he didn't, he would lose a major part of his supplies, and eventually his light and heat. He prepared as thoroughly as he could. He dressed in his darkest clothes, pulling on a thick hooded jacket and gloves to muffle any sound. He wrapped the flashlight in a scrap of dark cloth, leaving only a tiny slit for light. From the workbench, he selected a heavy iron pipe, solid, balanced, and capable of delivering a hard blow if absolutely necessary, though he reminded himself again and again, fighting was the last resort. Speed and silence were far better weapons. He checked the door to the corridor, confirmed the barrier was still secure, and then slipped out into the darkness. Moving through the maze without the dim overhead lights was a different kind of challenge. He relied on his memory and his sense of touch, running his fingers lightly along the edges of shelves to guide him. The thin beam of light cut through the thick dust motes, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Every small sound seemed amplified. The scuff of his shoe on a loose tile, the distant creak of settling wood, the soft thud of his own heartbeat. As he neared the back storage area, close to the loading dock, Ethan felt a prickle of unease run up his spine. The air felt different here, thicker, colder. He slowed his pace, moving even more carefully, peering around the corner of a tall stack of boxes. There were 2 of them in the aisle ahead. They stood near the damaged loading dock door, swaying slightly, their backs to him. But something was different. In the weeks before, Ethan had observed that the infected were slow, clumsy, almost dull-witted unless provoked. They would shuffle aimlessly for hours, ignoring small movements or faint sounds. But these 2, they seemed sharper. One of them, a man wearing the tattered remains of a security guard uniform, tilted his head upward. He sniffed the air, a sharp, jerky motion as if trying to catch a scent. The other turned slowly, scanning the darkness with those empty, glassy eyes. They weren't just reacting to loud noises anymore. They were sensing more. Ethan froze instantly, pressing himself flat against the nearest shelving unit. Beside him stood one of the tall, heavy metal cabinets used to store cleaning supplies and spare parts. He had used them many times before as temporary hiding spots. Slowly, silently, he reached for the handle. It was cold under his fingers. He pulled the door open just enough to squeeze inside, careful not to let it creak, and slid the door shut until only a hairline crack remained. Through that tiny gap he watched. The security guard, infected, shuffled a few steps closer, stopping no more than 10 feet from where Ethan hid. It tilted its head from side to side, its mouth opening and closing as if tasting the air. A low, guttural sound rumbled in its throat, deeper, more focused than the usual moans. It was as if the virus that had taken them had changed them, sharpening their senses over time, making them deadlier. Ethan held his breath until his lungs burned. He knew that if he made even the slightest sound, it would be over. He waited, counting the seconds in his head, his eyes fixed on the creature outside. Then, from the far end of the aisle, a soft clatter echoed, a loose piece of metal shifting in the draft. It was one of his old traps, disturbed by the change in air pressure now that the power was down. Instantly, both infected snapped their heads toward the sound. Their moans rose in pitch, hungry and eager, and they began to shuffle quickly away from the cabinet, moving toward the noise. Ethan let out a silent breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. He had been right, they were changing. Staying perfectly still might not be enough to save him forever. He would have to be smarter, faster, quieter. He waited until the sound of their footsteps faded completely, then slipped out of the cabinet and hurried the rest of the way to the generator shed. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar. He pushed it open just enough to slide inside, then closed and latched it behind him. The shed was small and smelled of oil and diesel fuel. Shining his light around, he found the large generator, its engine cool and silent. Beside it stood several large, sealed metal fuel tanks, enough to run the machine for weeks, if not months. He checked the fuel lines, ensured there were no leaks, and flipped the manual switch. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life, a deep, steady rumble that vibrated through the concrete floor. Ethan winced at the noise, knowing it would carry, but it was necessary. He waited a few minutes, and then the lights in the main building flickered weakly before glowing steadily once more. The familiar hum of the refrigeration units returned, and the security monitors on the desk in the safe room flickered back to life, showing grainy but usable images once again. He turned to leave, eager to get back to the safety of the storage area, when his light caught something on the dusty floor. Footprints, not the shuffling, uneven drag marks left by the infected. These were clear, distinct impressions in the thin layer of dust that had settled over the concrete. They were boot prints, human-sized with a distinct tread pattern, and they led from the door of the shed across the loading dock floor and into the main body of the supermarket. Ethan knelt down, shining his light carefully so as not to obscure the marks. They were fresh. The dust had not settled back into them, meaning they had been made within the last day or two. Someone had been here. A living person. A strange mix of emotions washed over him. For months, he had told himself he was the only one left. The silence had become his world, and the thought of another living human being sparked a faint, flickering hope deep inside. Hope that he was not alone, that there were others out there, that maybe help or safety existed somewhere beyond these walls. But that hope was quickly drowned out by a cold, hard caution. He remembered the first day. He remembered the panic, the way people had turned on each other, the way fear could make ordinary people do terrible things. The infected were predictable. They followed simple rules: noise, movement, hunger. But humans were unpredictable. They could think, they could plan, they could lie, and they could be far more dangerous than any mindless monster. Ethan moved quickly and silently back through the maze, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. When he finally slipped back into the safe room and bolted the door behind him, he leaned against it, listening intently. The monitors were working again, but he found himself staring at them with new eyes. He was no longer just watching for the dead. Now he was watching for the living, too. Over the next 3 days, he doubled his precautions. He checked every entrance, every vent, every possible way someone could get in. He added more traps, not just to distract the infected, but to warn him if anyone else was moving through the store. He tied thin, almost invisible fishing lines across the tops of aisles, attached to small, empty cans that would rattle if disturbed. He placed mirrors in hidden positions, so he could see around corners without exposing himself. He told himself he was imagining things, that the footprints were old, or that someone had come and gone long ago. But deep down, he knew the truth. The world outside was not just full of monsters. It was still full of people. And sooner or later, they would find their way here. 3 days later, while scanning the feeds from the front entrance, Ethan froze. Movement. Not the slow, shuffling gait of the infected, but quick, deliberate steps. He leaned forward, his face inches from the screen. 4 figures moved cautiously through the broken glass doors. They were dressed in heavy, practical clothing, carrying large backpacks. Each held a weapon, baseball bats wrapped in tape, metal pipes, and one man near the back carried a hunting rifle held loosely but ready. They moved with a practiced alertness, sweeping their flashlights across the aisles, their voices low and tense. Ethan sat back, his heart beginning to race again. He was not alone. For a moment, he felt that old, forgotten emotion stir in his chest, hope. He watched them move deeper into the store, and for a split second, he considered revealing himself. He thought of calling out, of telling them he was here, that he had food and shelter. Maybe they were good people. Maybe they had families, or skills, or news of a safe place. Maybe together they could survive better than he ever could alone. But as he watched, that hope began to wither. They moved through the aisles, but they did not move carefully. They knocked over displays, calling out loudly to one another. They smashed open the glass doors of the locked pharmacy cabinets, making sharp, crashing noises that echoed through the entire building. They grabbed what they wanted, tossing aside items they deemed useless, leaving a trail of debris in their wake. They were scavengers, loud, reckless, and dangerous. They didn't seem to care about the noise they made, or what it might attract. Ethan's hand curled into a fist on the desk. He realized then that he had become a ghost not just to survive the dead, but to survive the living as well. If these people found him, they would not see a fellow survivor. They would see supplies, shelter, and someone who knew how to stay hidden. They would see something to take, or someone to control. He watched them continue deeper into the store, getting closer and closer to the corridor leading to the safe room. He knew then that the rules had changed. He was no longer just hiding from the monsters that roamed the aisles. Now he had to hide from the people who walked among them. And as he watched the strangers' flashlights dance across the screens, Ethan understood that the silence he had worked so hard to maintain was now his only protection against both the dead and the living. For months, Ethan's world had been defined by silence and stillness. The only sounds that ever reached his ears were the distant, monotonous moans of the infected, the occasional creak of the building settling, or the soft hum of the generator. But now, as he watched the 4 figures move across the security monitors, the quiet was broken by something far more complex and unsettling, the voices of living people. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on the grainy black and white screens. There were 2 men, 1 woman, and a boy who looked to be roughly his own age, 16 or 17. They moved with a mixture of caution and confidence, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the dimness of the store. They were dressed in layered clothing, practical and worn, and each carried some form of weapon. The larger of the 2 men, broad-shouldered with a rough beard, held a heavy iron pipe like a baton. The other man, slimmer but with sharp, watchful eyes, gripped a baseball bat wrapped in black tape. The woman stayed slightly behind them, her hand resting on the shoulder of the younger boy, while a hunting rifle was slung over the leader's back. At first, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. It was a fragile, almost forgotten emotion, buried deep beneath months of fear and isolation. For so long, He had believed himself to be the only living soul left within miles. The idea that there were others, that humanity had not been completely wiped out, was both thrilling and terrifying. He found himself imagining what it would be like, to talk to someone, to share the burden of survival, to no longer be the ghost in the shadows. Maybe they were good people. Maybe they had news of safe zones, of places where order had been restored. Maybe together they could stand a better chance against the darkness that had swallowed the world. But as he continued to watch, that hope began to curdle into something colder and more cautious. They moved through the aisles, but there was nothing careful or respectful about the way they did it. They pushed aside shelves, knocking over displays of canned goods and sending boxes tumbling to the floor with loud crashes. They shouted to one another, their voices echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "Check that aisle. See if there's any medicine back there. Grab all the water you can carry." Completely oblivious to the danger such noise invited. When they reached the locked glass cabinets near the pharmacy, the larger man didn't bother looking for a key. He simply raised his pipe and smashed it against the glass, shattering it into 1,000 pieces with a sound like rolling thunder. Ethan winced with every crash. He knew exactly what those sounds meant. Every clatter, every shout, every shatter of glass acted like a dinner bell, calling the infected from every corner of the building and from the streets outside. He watched on the monitors as figures in the distance, slow, shuffling shapes, began to turn their heads toward the front of the store, drawn by the commotion. These people were not survivors, they were scavengers. And they were reckless, dangerous scavengers at that. He remembered the first day. He remembered the way fear had stripped away decency, turning ordinary people into animals desperate to save themselves. He thought of his own supplies, months of carefully rationed food, water, medicine, tools, everything he had worked so hard to gather and protect. If these people found him, would they see another human being in need of help? Or would they see a stockpile of resources and a threat to be eliminated? The answer became clearer with every passing minute. They moved deeper into the store, their trail of destruction marking their path. They tossed aside items they deemed useless, cereal, pasta, canned vegetables, while grabbing only what seemed most valuable: bottled water, energy bars, medical supplies, and anything that could be traded or used for defense. They didn't know the layout. They didn't understand the danger. And they were getting closer, closer to the maze, closer to the storage corridors, closer to the safe room itself. Ethan took a deep breath and pushed himself away from the monitors. Hope was a luxury he could not afford right now. His first duty was to protect himself and everything he had built. If these people were going to stay, he would not be able to simply wait them out. He would have to become even more of a ghost. He would have to make sure they never knew he existed. He moved quickly but silently, slipping out of the safe room and into the network of service passages he knew so well. He had prepared for this, though he had never truly expected it to happen. Over the months, he had created dozens of hidden caches, small stashes of supplies tucked behind heavy shelves, inside sealed cabinets, beneath floorboards, and in the upper storage lofts. He began moving the most valuable items from the more accessible storage areas into these hidden spots. He took the extra medicine, the concentrated food packets, the spare batteries, and the water purification tablets, relocating them so thoroughly that even if someone searched the room for hours, they would never find them. Next, he began to construct illusions. He knew that if they found signs of life, they would stay and search relentlessly. So he decided to leave signs that someone had been here, but had left long ago. He took old blankets and worn clothing he had found in the housewares section and arranged them in a messy pile in one of the far storage rooms, near the loading dock, the area farthest from his actual safe zone. He scattered empty cans and wrappers around it, making it look like a crude camp that had been abandoned weeks or even months before. On a piece of cardboard, he scrawled in large, messy letters, "Gone north, no food here, place is infested." It was a lie, but he hoped it was a convincing one. He also set up his distraction traps, but modified them. Instead of just making noise, he arranged them to create confusion. He balanced heavy boxes near the tops of shelves in the areas he wanted them to explore, and left loose boards on the floor that would creak loudly if stepped on. He wanted them to feel as though the store was dangerous, unstable, and already picked clean. For hours, he worked in the shadows, moving like a whisper through the aisles. He could hear them sometimes, their voices growing louder or fading as they moved. He stayed hidden, watching them from the gaps between shelves, observing their habits. He learned that the leader was aggressive and impatient, that the woman was more cautious and seemed to be looking for signs of danger, and that the younger boy was curious but easily led. As the afternoon wore on, they drew closer and closer to the rear of the store. They passed the bakery, the produce section, and moved toward the rows of canned goods that led to the service corridors. Ethan retreated back toward the safe room, his heart beating steadily but firmly. He was ready. If they came too close, he could trigger the noise traps deep in the dead zone, drawing them away. But then something went wrong. The teenage boy in the group, curious, perhaps looking for more supplies, stepped slightly ahead of the others. He wandered down a side aisle that led toward the outer storage area, an area Ethan had deliberately left looking cluttered and unstable. As he took another step, his foot caught on a loose metal grate that Ethan had left intentionally unsecured. The grate tipped, and with a loud, ringing clang, it fell flat against the concrete floor. The noise was sharp and distinct, cutting through the low hum of conversation. But it was what happened next that turned the air cold. Attached to that grate, as part of an old warning system Ethan had rigged, was a thin wire connected to a stack of empty metal cans balanced precariously on the top shelf. When the grate fell, it pulled the wire, and the cans came tumbling down in a loud, crashing cascade that echoed through the entire wing of the store. Silence fell immediately. Then, from everywhere at once, came the sound that Ethan had feared most. Shuffling feet, dragging footsteps, and rising above it all, a chorus of hungry, guttural moans, dozens of them growing louder and closer by the second. The scavengers froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the leader shouted, his voice sharp with panic, "Run!" They're coming from all sides. Ethan watched from his hiding spot behind a stack of pallets. He could see them now clearly. The infected were pouring in from the front, from the loading dock, and from the side entrances, drawn by the noise like moths to a flame. There were too many to count. They filled the aisles, a wall of ragged, moving bodies, blocking the path the group had used to enter. The 4 survivors backed away, huddling together near the junction of 3 aisles. They looked around wildly, but every direction seemed to be filling with the dead. The boy who had tripped was trembling, his face pale. The woman raised her bat, but her hands were shaking. The leader raised his rifle, but hesitated. He knew that firing it would only bring more. Ethan felt a conflict tearing at him. These people were strangers. They were loud, reckless, and had threatened his safety simply by being there. If they died, the danger would leave with them, and he could go back to his quiet life. It would be the safest thing for him to do, to stay hidden, let them be overwhelmed, and let the silence return. But as he watched the boy stumble backward, nearly falling, and saw the fear in their eyes, Ethan remembered himself. He remembered the first day, running for his life, terrified and alone. He remembered what it felt like to be trapped, with no way out. He couldn't just let them die. Not like this. His mind raced. He knew the store better than anyone. He knew the secret passages, the hidden doors, the ways to confuse the dead. He couldn't show himself, but he could guide them. He moved quickly and silently back to the main junction of the maze. There, near the ceiling, was a heavy metal shutter, one of the old fire doors that separated sections of the store. He had kept it in good working order, knowing it could be used to block or open paths. He grabbed the heavy pull chain and gave it a sharp, steady tug. With a low, groaning sound of metal on metal, the shutter began to roll upward, revealing a dark, narrow passageway that led through the service tunnels and out toward the side parking lot, an exit that was rarely used and mostly clear of the infected. At the same time, he reached for the longest rope he had prepared, running all the way to the far end of the store, near the loading dock. He pulled it hard, triggering a series of heavy objects, empty oil drums, metal shelves, and loose piping, to collapse and crash together in a deafening roar. The effect was instant. Every infected within hearing distance turned as one toward the new, louder noise. They shuffled away from the trapped survivors, drawn toward the chaos at the back. The path toward the newly opened passage was momentarily clear. The group stared at the open shutter, then at the direction the infected had turned. They didn't understand what had happened, but they understood an escape route when they saw one. Go. Go, go, go. The leader shouted, pushing them forward. They scrambled through the narrow opening, tripping over one another in their haste. The last one through, the woman glanced back over her shoulder, her eyes wide and confused, as if she felt that they were not alone. But then she followed the others, and the passage was empty again. Ethan waited until he heard their footsteps fade away through the tunnel and out into the street. Then he released the chain, and the heavy shutter slammed shut again, sealing the passage. He waited longer, until the infected had finished investigating the noise and had begun to wander back into their usual patterns, the threat slowly receding. When it was safe, he returned to the safe room and sat down in front of the monitors, watching the empty aisles. He had saved them, but they had no idea. They would never know that a boy who had lived in the shadows for months had given them a second chance. Later that night, long after the sun had set and the store was quiet again, he heard voices from the parking lot outside, faint but clear enough to make out through the thick walls. "Did you see that?" one of them asked, the boy's voice sounding shaky but relieved. "That door just opened, and then all those things ran the other way. It was like magic." "It wasn't magic," the woman replied, her voice low and uneasy. "It was like something was leading them away. Or leading us out." "This place is wrong," the leader said, a note of fear in his tough tone. "Too quiet. Things move on their own. It's like it's haunted. I don't want to come back here again. There's nothing here but trouble." "Yeah," the other man agreed, "haunted. Let's get out of here before whatever's in there decides it doesn't like us." Their voices faded as they moved away into the darkness, heading toward the tree line on the other side of the road. Ethan sat in the dim light, listening until he could hear them no more. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. He had done the right thing, he thought. But he had also learned a valuable lesson. The world outside was full of people, and many of them were desperate, dangerous, and driven by fear. The idea of joining them, of revealing himself, seemed more foolish now than ever. They thought the supermarket was haunted. They thought it was empty and dangerous. And that was exactly how Ethan wanted it. He stood up and walked to the wall where he kept his marks. He picked up the nail and added another scratch. Then he walked to the door of the safe room, checked the locks, and moved the heavy barricades back into place. He was still alone. But for now, that was the safest way to be. Time had become a strange, elastic thing inside Greenhill's supermarket. For Ethan Vale, it was no longer measured by months or seasons, but by the slow, steady accumulation of marks on the concrete wall beside his bed. 180 days. 200. 250. By the time nearly a full year had passed since the world ended, Ethan had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like a life, though it was a life defined entirely by caution, silence, and the constant need to adapt. He had come to truly believe that he had built something unbreakable. To him, the supermarket was no longer just a building, it was a fortress. It had walls of concrete and steel, endless supplies, and a layout he knew better than the back of his hand. He had the dead zone where the infected gathered but rarely ventured beyond. The maze, his secret network of passages that allowed him to move unseen, and the safe room, his impenetrable stronghold in the back. For months, this system had worked flawlessly. He had outweighted the chaos, outsmarted the infected, and even outmaneuvered the living scavengers who had stumbled into his territory. He had begun to think that if he stayed quiet, stayed hidden, and kept his defenses strong, he could survive here indefinitely. But as the old saying went, the strongest walls can still crumble and the safest hiding places can be found. The first signs of trouble were subtle, so subtle that Ethan almost dismissed them as his imagination playing tricks after months of isolation. It started with the infected. For as long as he could remember, they had followed predictable patterns. They lingered near the front entrance, drawn by the open air and the sounds of the street outside. They rarely ventured deep into the storage areas, as if some instinct kept them away from the darker and closed spaces. But now that pattern was changing. He began to see them appearing in places they never used to be. One morning, while checking the security monitors, he spotted a lone figure shuffling near the back loading dock, an area that had been mostly clear for months. A few days later, there were 3 of them wandering through the canned goods aisle, far closer to his safe zone than they had ever come. They moved with that same stiff, uncoordinated gait, but there was a new persistence to them. They didn't just wander aimlessly anymore. They seemed to drift inward, slowly but steadily, as if drawn by a faint, invisible pull. Ethan told himself it was nothing. Perhaps the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of spoiled food deeper into the store. Perhaps the old habits were simply breaking down over time. But he began to patrol more frequently, checking the barriers he had built at the loading dock and the side entrances. That was when he found the breaches. The loading dock door had always been a weak point. It had been damaged on the first day, bent out of shape and difficult to close properly. Over the months, rain, wind, and the constant pressure of bodies pressing against it from the outside had taken their toll. When Ethan examined it closely, he saw that the gap between the door and the frame had widened significantly, enough for a thin person to squeeze through, or for a small group of the infected to push their way in one by one. Worse, the heavy wooden pallets and concrete blocks he had stacked against it from the inside had shifted, settling unevenly and leaving small gaps and weak spots. But it was not just the loading dock. During one of his silent patrols through the maze, he discovered a rusted ventilation shaft hidden behind a stack of old cardboard boxes. It was located high up on the wall, near the ceiling, and its metal grating had completely rotted away, leaving an opening large enough for an adult to crawl through. It led from the outside directly into the service corridors, bypassing almost all of his outer defenses. He had never noticed it before, hidden as it was by years of dust and debris. His fortress was not as solid as he had believed. It was aging, just like everything else in this broken world. And with its age came weakness. The problems were not just structural. His supplies were also beginning to show their limits. The walk-in freezer, which had worked reliably for nearly a year, was starting to fail. The compressor made a strange, rattling noise now, and the temperature inside no longer stayed as low as it used to. Ethan could feel the difference the moment he stepped inside. The air was no longer bitingly cold, but merely cool. He checked the thermometers he had placed inside, and his heart sank. Over the last few weeks, the temperature had risen steadily. At this rate, within a month, it would be too warm to keep frozen goods preserved. He had already begun eating through the frozen meat and vegetables, prioritizing them over the canned goods, but the loss still felt like a major blow. He had relied on that freezer as a safety net, a promise that he would never go hungry. Now that safety net was unraveling. He calculated his remaining supplies carefully, using the notebooks he had filled with lists and calculations. The canned goods were still plentiful. Beans, soups, fruits, and vegetables would last for a long time. Rice, pasta, flour, and sugar were also abundant. But water was another matter. While there were many cases of bottled water, the plastic was beginning to degrade slightly, and he knew that eventually he would need a way to collect and purify rainwater or find another source. The generator, too, had a limited lifespan. He had enough fuel to run it for another 6 months, maybe a little longer if he used it sparingly, but after that he would be left in the dark and the cold. For the first time in nearly 12 months, Ethan allowed himself to truly consider the possibility that staying hidden here forever might not be an option. He had always thought of this place as his sanctuary, but now it felt more like a cage, one that was slowly rusting away around him. The thought was terrifying. Where else could he go? The world outside was filled with the infected, and from what he had seen, other survivors could be just as dangerous. But if he stayed, he would eventually run out of food, water, and power, trapped in a building that was slowly falling apart. It was a heavy, unsettling realization, and it hung over him like a cloud as he went about his daily routines. But as troubling as the failing infrastructure and dwindling supplies were, they were not the worst threat he faced. That came a few days later, when he found the evidence that he was no longer the only one thinking about this supermarket. He had decided to inspect the area near the loading dock more thoroughly, moving through the shadows just after dawn when the light was dimmest and the infected were usually less active. He was checking the area around the generator shed, making sure it was still secure, when he noticed something strange on the concrete floor. Footprints, but these were different from the ones he had seen months before. These were not just random marks left by someone passing through. They were organized. They went back and forth in straight lines, as if someone had been pacing, measuring, or observing. There were also scuff marks along the walls, as if they had been leaning against them, watching the entrance for hours at a time. Ethan knelt down, running his finger lightly over the dust. The prints were fresh, no more than a day or two old. Someone had been studying the building. He moved quickly, his usual caution turning into sharp urgency, and began searching the surrounding area. Behind a stack of empty wooden pallets, tucked away in a shadowed corner where it would not be easily seen, he found it. A crumpled piece of paper, half covered in dust but still intact. He picked it up carefully and smoothed it out. It was a rough sketch of the supermarket. Not a perfect map, but detailed enough to be recognizable. The front entrance was marked, the aisles were roughly drawn, and the loading dock was clearly indicated. But what made Ethan's blood run cold was the section at the back. There, near the area of the storage rooms and the service corridors, someone had drawn a large circle. Scrawled in messy pencil handwriting beside it were the words, "Storage high chance of supplies, someone living here." They knew. They didn't have proof, not yet. They hadn't found his hidden door or his barriers. But they suspected. They had put the pieces together. The fact that the place was not completely ransacked, the strange signs, the supplies that seemed to vanish from certain areas, the way the building felt occupied even when it looked empty. Someone had figured out that he was here. Ethan crumpled the paper in his hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scavengers who had come before had been reckless and loud, driven by hunger and fear. But whoever had left this map was different. They were organized. They were observant. They planned, and that made them far more dangerous. He hurried back to the safe room and sat down in front of the monitors, scanning every screen with new intensity. For hours he watched, but he saw nothing, only the usual slow movement of the infected and the empty aisles. But he knew they were out there, watching, waiting. He didn't know how many there were. He didn't know if they were the same group from before or new people. But he knew that sooner or later they would come back. And when they did, they wouldn't be running blindly through the aisles. They would be looking for him. There was no more time to wait and hope things would get better. The fortress was falling apart from the inside, and there were people outside who wanted to break in. Ethan had to prepare. He had to decide what he was willing to protect, and how far he was willing to go to protect it. Over the next 3 days, he worked with a frantic energy he had not felt since the first week of the outbreak. He knew that if they came, his current hiding place might not be enough. He had built his barriers to keep out the mindless dead, but living people were smarter. They could use tools, they could work together, and they could be patient. He began by strengthening the safe room itself. He dragged the heaviest items he could find, large metal cabinets, refrigeration units, stacks of concrete blocks, and piled them against the outer door, creating a barrier that would take hours to break through. He reinforced the hinges and locks with heavy steel plates and bolts he found in the hardware section. If they wanted to get in, they would have to work for it and make a lot of noise doing it, noise that would attract every infected within a mile. But he also knew that staying trapped in one place was a death sentence. So he worked on his escape routes. He re-explored every inch of the maze, clearing debris from the narrowest passages and making sure they were still passable. He found 3 different ways out of the building. One through the old loading dock, one through a broken window in the storage loft, and one through a long-abandoned service tunnel that led out to the street behind the building. He marked each route clearly in his mind and even left small supplies, bottled water, energy bars, a flashlight, hidden at each exit just in case he had to leave in a hurry. Next, he sorted through his supplies. He could not carry everything, so he had to choose what was most important. He packed a large, sturdy backpack with the essentials: medical supplies, water purification tablets, a multi-tool, extra batteries, a waterproof map, and enough high-calorie food to last for weeks. The rest of his supplies, canned goods, tools, blankets, he moved to the deepest, most hidden parts of the building, tucking them away in places only he knew existed. If he had to leave, he wanted them to be impossible to find. If he stayed, they would remain safe. As he worked, his mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. He had survived for nearly a year by being invisible. He had learned that silence and solitude were the keys to staying alive. But now he was being forced to confront a terrible truth. The dead were dangerous, but the living were unpredictable. The infected wanted only to feed. They had no malice, no plans, no cruelty. But humans, they could be greedy, violent, and cruel. They could look at another person and see only something to take, or someone to control. But as he sat in the dim light of the safe room that evening, looking at the scratches on the wall that marked his time alone, he also wondered if he was becoming something different too. He had spent so long hiding, so long viewing every stranger as a threat, that he had almost forgotten what it was like to talk to someone, to trust, to feel like part of something bigger than just his own survival. He stood up and walked to the heavy metal door that separated him from the rest of the store. He rested his hand against the cold, solid surface. Outside, in the darkness, were people. They might be dangerous. They might want to hurt him. But they were also alive. They were like him, trying to make it through each day. For a long time, he stood there, listening to the distant sounds. The soft moans of the infected, the wind rustling against the broken windows, the faint creaks of the old building settling. He thought about the choice he might soon have to make, to hide and fight or to try to reach out. To treat them as enemies or to see them as people. But before he could resolve those thoughts, he heard it. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the generator. But it was unmistakable. Footsteps. Not the slow, dragging shuffle of the infected. These were firm, deliberate, and heavy. They were moving carefully, but they were moving with purpose. And they were getting closer. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back from the door and moved to the small peephole he had drilled through the wall, covered with a metal plate so it could not be seen from the outside. He slid the plate aside and pressed his eye to the gap. The corridor was dimly lit, but he could see the beam of flashlights dancing against the walls. He heard voices, low, muffled, but clear enough to understand. "Slow down," a man said. "We know it's back here. Don't make too much noise, but be ready." "Whoever it is, they've got to have food and supplies," another voice replied. "We've been watching for days. They don't leave. They are hoarding it all." Ethan's hand tightened around the metal pipe he kept at his side. He watched as the shadows grew larger, moving closer and closer to the barrier he had built. They were right outside. Ethan pressed his eye to the narrow peephole, his breath coming in slow, controlled draws. The beam of a flashlight cut through the dimness of the service corridor, sweeping back and forth across the stacked pallets and heavy boxes that formed the first line of defense for his safe room. Outside, the voices were clearer now, low, rough, and carrying a weight of expectation and greed that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Look at this," one man said, his tone thick with suspicion as he kicked at the base of the barrier. "All this stuff piled up. Nobody does this unless they've got something worth hiding." "Or someone worth hiding," another added, his voice sharper, colder. "We saw the signs. The food that doesn't run out. The lights that work sometimes. This place isn't empty. There's a rat back here, and rats hoard everything they find. Ethan pulled back from the peephole, his hand closing firmly around the cold, solid metal pipe he kept within easy reach. For nearly 12 months, he had lived by one simple rule: stay hidden, stay quiet, and avoid contact. He had learned that noise drew the infected, and curiosity could get you killed. But now the rules had changed completely. The threat was no longer mindless, driven only by hunger and instinct. These were people. They thought, they planned, and they wanted what he had spent a year protecting. He moved silently to the bank of security monitors, adjusting the angle of the screen to get a better view of the corridor. There were 3 of them, all men. They were dressed in heavy, worn clothing, their faces streaked with dirt and fatigue, but their eyes were alert and hard. One carried a crowbar, another a heavy wooden club, and the third held a pistol, the barrel glinting faintly in the reflected light. They moved with a confidence that came from being armed and believing they held all the power. They did not look like people who were simply looking for shelter or companionship. They looked like predators who had tracked their prey to its lair. Ethan sat back, his mind racing. He had spent so long fearing the infected, those shuffling, grotesque figures that roamed the aisles, that he had almost forgotten what real danger could look like. The dead were predictable. They followed a simple pattern: noise, movement, hunger. But these men were different. They could lie, they could wait, they could be cruel. They could choose to hurt him, not because they were driven by some sickness, but because they wanted what he had. They were the real monsters that the apocalypse had unleashed. For a moment, anger flared inside him, hot and sharp. This was his home. He had fought for it, suffered for it, kept it safe when the rest of the world had fallen apart. He had rationed every meal, patched every leak, and hidden in the dark for months. Now these strangers thought they could just walk in and take it all. But beneath the anger, there was also a deep, weary sadness. He remembered the world before. He remembered people laughing, helping one another, caring for their neighbors. He remembered that humanity was supposed to be more than just survival. But looking at the men on the screen, he could barely see any trace of that world left in them. He watched them as they began to work on the barrier. The man with the crowbar wedged it into the gap between 2 heavy pallets, grunting with effort as he pried at the wood. Crack. The sound echoed through the narrow corridor, sharp and loud. Ethan knew that noise would travel. He had spent months learning exactly how sound moved through the building, how it bounced off the metal shelves and concrete walls, how it drifted out into the main aisles and beyond. But the men didn't seem to care. They were too focused on what they thought was waiting for them behind the walls. Easy, the man with the gun warned, though there was no real concern in his voice, only caution. Don't break it all at once. We don't want it collapsing on us. Relax, the other replied, giving the barrier another hard shove. Whoever's in here is probably just a kid or an old man. They won't put up much of a fight. Once we get in, we take what we need and move on. Ethan listened to their words, and a strange calm settled over him. He was no longer the frightened boy who had run into the storage room on that first day. He was the one who knew this place better than anyone. He knew every passage, every hiding spot, every weakness, and every strength. He was not trapped here. He was the ghost in the machine, and the building was his. He moved quickly but without panic. He had prepared for this moment, even if he had hoped it would never come. First, he went to the heavy steel door that led deeper into the service tunnels, the escape route he had reinforced and stocked weeks before. He made sure it was unlocked and ready, the path clear behind it. Then he turned his attention to the barrier itself. Along the top of the stacked pallets and shelves, hidden from view, was a network of thin wires. They were attached to supports, but also connected to a heavy shelf unit that was bolted to the wall but balanced precariously. Resting on that shelf were dozens of large, heavy cans of food and several metal storage bins. It was not a trap designed to hurt anyone. Ethan had never wanted to kill anyone, even if they were dangerous. It was designed to create confusion, noise, and an opportunity. He also had another advantage. Near the outer wall, connected to the same system, was a long rope that ran all the way to the far end of the building, near the loading dock, an area where he had left piles of scrap metal, loose shelving, and empty oil drums. He waited. The men outside worked steadily, the sounds of their efforts growing louder and more frequent. Thud, scrape, crack. The barrier began to shift, small gaps appearing between the wooden planks. "Almost there," the man with the crowbar said, grunting. "Give me a hand here." Together, they pushed against the pallets. With a loud groan of shifting wood and metal, the barrier gave way. It collapsed inward slightly, creating a large enough opening for them to squeeze through. "Got it," the leader said, stepping forward and shining his light into the darkness beyond. "Let's see what we've got." As soon as the opening was wide enough, Ethan pulled the first rope. There was a sharp twang as the wires released. The heavy shelf unit above the doorway tipped forward, and with a tremendous crash, the cans and metal bins tumbled down, creating a deafening wave of noise and dust. The men stumbled back, shouting in surprise and alarm as the debris hit the floor. "What the hell?" But before they could recover, Ethan pulled the second rope. Far away at the opposite end of the supermarket, the weight triggered a much larger collapse. Metal scrap fell, shelves tipped, and oil drums rolled and crashed into one another. The sound was immense, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. And then the response came. From every corner of the store, the familiar, terrifying sound began to rise. Shuffling feet, dragging footsteps, and the low, hungry moans that swelled into a chorus of hunger. The noise had acted exactly as intended. It had not only startled the men, it had called every infected within the building, and likely many from the streets outside, to converge toward the loading dock, away from Ethan, but also away from the path the men had taken to get here. But the men didn't know that. All they heard was the sound of dozens, then hundreds, of the dead moving rapidly toward them. "They are coming," one of them yelled, his earlier confidence vanishing instantly, replaced by raw, unmasked fear. "All of them. They're coming from everywhere. Run. Back the way we came." The leader shouted, turning and scrambling over the debris of the broken barrier. They didn't stop to look around. They didn't try to search further. They only wanted to escape the noise and the things it had summoned. They stumbled back down the corridor, tripping over their own feet, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they ran toward the front entrance. Ethan watched them go through the monitors, remaining perfectly still and silent until the sound of their footsteps faded completely into the distance. He waited for a long time after that, listening as the infected moved toward the noise at the loading dock, their shuffling and moans slowly settling into a new pattern. When he was absolutely certain that the immediate danger had passed, he let out a long, slow breath and leaned back against the wall. He had won this round. He had protected himself without having to harm anyone. But as he looked around the safe room, at the scratches marking the days on the wall, at the supplies he had so carefully arranged, he realized that this was not a victory. It was only a temporary delay. The men would likely come back, or others would follow. The supermarket was too valuable a resource, too obvious a shelter for people to ignore forever. And the building itself was failing, its defenses weakening, its power dwindling, its structure aging. Staying here forever was no longer a viable plan. It was only a matter of time before the fortress fell completely. Over the next few days, Ethan did not return to his old routine. Instead, he began to think differently. He had spent so long viewing the world as divided into two simple groups: the dead, who wanted to eat him, and the living, who wanted to take from him. But after what had happened, he began to question that view. He worked on improving his defenses further, but he also began to prepare for the possibility of leaving. He packed his backpack with the essentials, keeping it ready by the door at all times. He updated his maps, not just of the supermarket, but of the surrounding streets and buildings, using the old road maps he had found in the magazine rack. He also began to change the way he viewed his supplies. Instead of seeing them only as something to hoard and protect, he started to think of them as something that could be shared, if he ever found people worthy of trust. But most of all, he thought about what it meant to survive. For months, he had believed that staying alive was the goal. But as he sat in the dim light, alone with his thoughts, he began to wonder if there was more to it than just breathing. He had survived, yes, but he had also been living in the dark, in silence, in constant fear. Was that really living? Or was it just existing? He remembered the first group of survivors he had saved. He had watched them, and they had been reckless and loud, but he had also seen the way they looked out for one another, how the woman had protected the boy, how they had moved together even when they were afraid. He remembered the men who had come this time, and how greed and fear had twisted them into something dangerous. But he also realized that not everyone would be like that. The world was broken, yes, but it was not entirely lost. There were still people who remembered how to be human. One evening, a few days after the incident, Ethan sat at the security desk, watching the empty aisles. The power was flickering slightly, a reminder that it would not last forever. He looked at the door leading out of the safe room, then at the door leading into the service tunnels and out into the world beyond. He thought about opening it, about stepping out from behind the walls he had built. He didn't trust the world outside. He didn't know if he would ever fully trust anyone again after what he had seen. But he knew that staying here forever would eventually become a prison. He would grow older, alone, watching the world pass him by until the food ran out or the walls finally crumbled. He stood up and walked over to the heavy metal door that sealed off his corridor. He ran his hand over the cold surface, feeling the scratches and dents that marked his time here. Then slowly, he began to move the heavy cabinets and shelves he had stacked against it. One by one, he shifted them aside until the door was clear. He checked the lock, ensuring it still worked, but he did not slide the bolt home. He left it unlocked, resting only in its frame. It was not an invitation. It was not a surrender. It was a choice. Ethan walked back to the desk and picked up his notebook. He flipped through the pages, filled with lists of supplies, maps, observations of the infected, and the hundreds of marks counting the days. At the bottom of the last page, he wrote a single line: "The dead are easy to understand. The living are the mystery." He looked at the monitors one last time, scanning the familiar aisles. This place had been his sanctuary, his teacher, and his prison. It had taught him silence, patience, and how to fight for what was his. But it was time to consider what came next. He stood in the center of the room, between the safety of the storage room and the unknown of the world outside. He was still the quiet boy who had run for his life a year ago. But he was also something more. He was a survivor. He was careful, he was strong, and he knew how to stay hidden when he needed to. But he also knew that sometimes, to truly survive, you had to stop hiding. He did not leave that night. He was not ready yet. There was still planning to do, supplies to organize, and the danger outside was still very real. But as he turned off the lights and settled down to rest, he knew that the door was no longer fully closed. It was slightly ajar, a crack between the safety of the shadows and the possibility of something more. The apocalypse was far from over. The road ahead would be filled with danger, from both the dead and the living. But in the last aisle of the supermarket, the boy who had survived alone had finally realized that survival was not just about staying hidden. It was about being ready, ready to defend himself, ready to run, and perhaps one day ready to find others who still held onto their humanity. And as the silence of the night settled over the store, Ethan Vale waited, watching, and wondering what the next chapter of his life would bring.